after Daniel 7, Daniel 8 feels fairly similar. Again, we have some sort of body of water, in this case a river rather than a sea. Again, we have animals coming out of it, maybe less frightening. They are more domestic kinds of animals, but still, we have a goat and a ram coming out, but they feature as their most prominent sort of physical feature, at least the one that is interpreted, and this was true in the last chapter also, we just didn't get to it, is their horns. What's the significance of the animal's horns, both on the beasts in the last chapter and for the ram and the goat here?
Well, the horn symbolizes power. Mm-hmm. There are prayers that God would raise up the horn of David. And, it's a nice image, whether you think of a bull or you just say one horn, maybe you think of a unicorn, mm-hmm. but it's something that could gore you. Now, the ram was traditionally associated with Persia, and you get this in the signs of the zodiac. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not clear whether that was fully developed by the time Daniel was written, but at least it corresponds. Mm-hmm. And the he-goat here is Alexander the Great. And there's a little humour in that, too. But now, to come back to what we skipped over in chapter 7, mm-hmm. the last beast in Daniel 7 was really a piece of work.
Yeah.
He was, and one of the things that he does is trample people with his feet. And mm-hmm. people think that this was inspired by the war elephants. Mm-hmm. The war elephants, were a novelty in the 2nd century BC, sure. and terrifying. The thought of being trampled by an elephant would put the fear of God into anybody.
Yeah.
Now, but this fourth beast also had, first of all, 10 horns.
Yeah.
Again, fairly freaky. Some people think the imagery of that came from a crown, where you had, little horns sticking up in it. In Daniel, it's supposed to mean there are 10 kings, and people have racked their brain to identify which 10 they're referring to. But I think, they just said 10 is a nice number.
Yeah.
There are plenty. But then there is a little horn that comes after that, which supplants the others. And it's this little horn, with the implication that this is an upstart who doesn't really belong in there. That's the one that turns out to symbolize Antiochus Epiphanes, the king who interfered with the cult in Jerusalem.
Yeah, and so that little horn appears both in 7 and in 8. Again, Antiochus, really a crucial figure in sort of the development of Judaism altogether. I mean, the Maccabean revolt, but of all of the sort of overlords from the Mesopotamians onward, really Antiochus, so much antipathy toward him in Judaism, as really, I guess, beginning here in some sense.
I suppose we should fill in a little bit here on who Antiochus was and where he came out of.
Yeah.
You see, the world changed in the late 4th century BCE when Alexander the Great went on his campaigns all the way over to India.
Yeah.
And changed all that area. And then when he died, this was carved up among his generals. Mm-hmm. And for roughly 100 years, Judea was under the Ptolemies of Egypt. And nothing of great moment seems to have happened.
Yeah. That was okay.
Well, it was okay. There was a slave trade. It probably wasn't okay for everybody, but nothing worth rebelling against. Mm-hmm. And then in 198, the Syrians conquered that part. And the Syrian kings were all named either Antiochus or Seleucus. Mm-hmm. And now one of them was Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great. He was the one who conquered Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And at first they welcomed him. It seemed to be all getting along great. There was no thought of rebelling against him. But he then got into trouble with the Romans. Mm-hmm. And the Romans demanded a heavy tribute. And from that time on, the Seleucids, as the kings of Syria were called, were constantly trying to find money to pay off the Romans. Yeah. And there's a story in the 2nd book of Maccabees how they tried to get money out of the temple in Jerusalem. If there are funds supposedly lying around, they belong to the king.
Sure.
That's the principle of it. Mm-hmm. So that put a strain on things. Now, when Antiochus IV came along in 175, he had been a hostage in Rome, but he had the same problems.
Yeah.
And you find very early on, a man named Jason went to him taking the tribute, and he said, if you made me high priest, I'd get you a bigger tribute. And the king said, wonderful idea. Mm-hmm. You're high priest. Now he goes back, and then a little later, somebody else gets to bring the tribute, a man named Menelaus, and he says to the king, I'll get you an even bigger tribute. And this is really what causes the friction in Jerusalem. Eventually fighting breaks out between Jason and Menelaus, and then the king thinks they're rebelling against his authority, and he sends in the troops and puts them down hard. And that's what sets up this persecution. That's where Antiochus Epiphanes comes out of.
And this is where the Maccabean revolt comes in response to.
And the Maccabean revolt then comes in response to that. Because in part of his suppression of Jerusalem, he said, you can no longer keep your traditional laws. That means you can no longer observe your traditional cult. Mm-hmm. Forget the Passover. Instead, you celebrate my birthday. Yeah. You have a festival in honor of Dionysus. Well, this, was a bridge too far for most people. This is actually what pushed them to revolt. And it's for that reason that Antiochus Epiphanes is despised in a way that even Nebuchadnezzar was not.
Right. Although it's safe to say that it was really much more a sort of systemic problem for which he was just the crystallized embodiment. I mean, he was as bad as he gets when it comes to that. But you had Jews, Jason and Menelaus, who were already sort of starting to unravel what was the fabric of the long-standing fabric of society. You can see why, in that sense, we've talked about this before, why people would have looked at the time and thought, everything we've ever known is coming to an end here. I mean, the temple of all places is sort of collapsed into politics and money and then sort of been overrun by pagans. It must have been a very a terrifying sort of thing.
Now, in Daniel chapter 8, the takeover of the temple is described as an assault on heaven.
Right. That
this little horn attacks the stars and knocks some of them to the ground and tramples on them. Mm-hmm. Well, this is figurative language, obviously, but what does it mean if he knocks down some of the host of heaven? In Daniel 7, it was said of the little horn that he will wear out the holy ones of the Most High. And some people have looked at this and says, but surely he couldn't wear out angels. But the point is that he could. Mm-hmm. That's what they're saying, that he actually succeeded in storming heaven for a while and was getting right up there close to the Most High himself. Mm-hmm. And then he is struck down by no human hand, is the way it's put. This is an old myth. It's Lucifer, son of dawn, Hail Hal ben Shachar in the Hebrew Bible, the one who tries to rise above the stars of Ale, above the stars of God.
Yeah.
And is cast down.
The next chapter, after 8, chapter 9, is in some ways quite different. It uses some this sort of apocalyptic interpretation, but it really harkens back to sort of many more traditional elements of sort of biblical thought. We get almost Deuteronomistic concepts and language. There's punishment for not obeying the Torah. There's all sorts of stuff, and there is most notably explicit reinterpretation of earlier clearly biblical material. Most notably, famously, Daniel seems to pick up the book of Jeremiah, and in which he reads that it will be 70 years between the exile and the restoration, and Daniel is now living well past that point. And that prophecy is not so good for him anymore.
Now, of course, if you believed the literal framework of the book of Daniel, he would still be within the 70 years,
right?
I think. So, it only becomes a problem If you pick it up and it says, Jerusalem will be desolate for 70 years. What's so problematic about that? What's so obscure? Well, it's only obscure if you're living a couple of 100 years later and Jerusalem is desolate again.
Right.
And that's the problem, really, from the viewpoint of Daniel. And so he prays, and an angel comes to explain it to him. To give the angel time to get there, he recites a long prayer. And the prayer, isn't a great fit for the context. It's not a prayer for enlightenment. It's a typical prayer, we have sinned, we have done wrong, kind of standard Deuteronomic theology. But when the angel gets there, he says, Daniel, I set out as soon as I got the message. None of this stuff applies. All of this is predetermined. What this really means, 70 years means 70 weeks of years.
Well, that's convenient.
To which you say, but of course, right? Why should 70 years mean 70 weeks of years? Well, you see, the assumption is that everything is mysterious. Nothing really means what it is. If you see a ram and a he-goat, it's not a ram and a he-goat, it's two kings. If you see somebody that looks like a man on the clouds of heaven, one thing you know is it's not a man. And if Jeremiah says 70 years, it doesn't really mean 70 years.
Yeah. And what is, I think, so important about this is not just the math. It's that you can see, even within the Bible itself, you can see interpreters taking plain words and making them mean something that is totally different but is relevant to their own time.
That's right.
And this is, when we have people still today who say literal, literal, literal for how to understand the Bible, we have people in the Bible themselves who are not treating the text that way, who recognize that it is there to be made relevant in whatever way you can.
Yes.
Right?
Now, you may say 70 weeks of years, and then what? Now, the question that runs through all of the second half of Daniel is, how long is the temple going to be desolate? How long is the temple going to be desecrated? And what they typically come down to is 3.5 years. A time, times, and half a time. In Daniel 7, in Daniel 8. Now, in the 70 weeks of years, you go over 69 of those weeks very, very fast. And then the attention focuses on the last week. You can recognize what's happening in the first half of the last week. A high priest gets killed, for example. The temple is desecrated. And then it's the last half week or 3.5 years is supposed to be how long it's going to be until the temple is set right. Now, but of course, in later interpretation, when the temple was long gone, people said this must be until the end of the world. And for the last 1,000 years or so, people have regularly reinterpreted Daniel's numbers to come up with a new date for the end of the world. Famous one in Ohio in the 1840s called the Millerites. A man named William Miller, a farmer, got to speculating on this, and people pressed him on it, and so he said that it would be on some date in October of 1843. And so his followers sold their belongings and assembled on a hill. And the sun came up again the next morning.
And here we are today.
And here we are today. And so eventually some of his followers went off and became the Seventh-day Adventists. But just a couple of years ago, we had a man named Harold Camping who did the math again and decided it was going to be some date in August, was it 2012, 11 or 12, something like that. Camping at least had the honesty afterwards to say, well, I guess I was wrong. But he was probably the first interpreter ever to admit that he was wrong.
I mean, I think one of the interesting features of these chapters is that Daniel has gone from the person who interprets everyone else's dreams, to someone who receives visions and requires interpretation of them himself. He needs, he sees vision and says, I don't know what to do with this. And down comes an angel. It's a very, it's taking the same themes, but just, turning them into this new, this new genre. And again, it's saying something about how interpretation works, not just how revelation works, but how interpretation works, I think.
Indeed. And he's much easier to identify with, I think, in the second half of the book.
Right.
Lots of people have read these visions and said, I don't know what the hell this means. So
we are going to get to, I think, the most dramatic of them in the last 3 chapters of Daniel, which we'll do in our next session.